Hello, welcome to FunBikes TV. Today we're going to build our 49cc petrol big wheel mini quad. Your box will arrive you like this. The first thing you'll need to do is open the box. Cut the green banding and then open your box up by cutting the sellotape on the box and then split the box sides. As you can see, the quad is inside a steel crate. Inside the cage there is also your fixings and fittings box. To remove the quad from the cage, you will need to undo the 4 Allen key bolts that hold the cage together. You will need a 5 Allen key for this. Once you have undone the Allen key bolts, you can then lift the top section of the cage away. You will then need to cut the wires holding the quad in at the front and the back to allow you to lift it out from the second part of the cage. We're now going to open our contents box that arrived with the vehicle. Inside your contents box you will find the following items: your front number board, your mixing bottle, your bar pad, your maintenance toolkit, your fuel cap, your fuel breather pipe, bag of various nuts, bolts and fittings, your front bull bar, your manual and a starting guide for the quad. We're now going to fit our front number board and handlebars to the vehicle. To do this, start with, we will remove the 10 bolt from the centre of the steering column. Apply a small quantity of stud lock to the end of the bolt. Take your front number board and place the bolt through the number board and then reattach it to the steering column. When you position the number board, make sure that it is central and equal distance on both sides between the bolt holes at the front. Once you are happy with this, fully tighten your front number board using a 10 spanner or socket. We're now ready to fit our handlebars. To start off with, place the handlebars over the top of the front number board and feed the cables neatly behind the number board. In your various nuts and bolts bag you will find 4 black handlebar clamps. The 2 smooth ones go on the bottom of the handlebars. The 2 with the notches out of them go on the top of the handlebars. You'll find 4 bolts in your fixing bag. You need the 2 longest ones and the 2 that are slightly shorter. You will also find 2 spacers in the bag. Take one of your slightly shorter bolts, a lower handlebar clamp which is smooth on the bottom. You will see there are notches in your handlebars. These are to help you align the handlebars centrally when you place them in the clamps. Place the top clamp over the top of the handlebars and then use the short bolt at the front towards the number board to loosely attach your handlebars. Repeat this process on the opposite side. Using the longer bolts, place a small quantity of stud lock onto the end of the thread and then place it through the key barrel. Then take one of your spacers and slide it onto the bolt. Lift the handlebars up and align the bolt with the brackets and loosely fit it into the steering column. Repeat this process on the opposite side, again applying stud lock to the end of the threads. Once you've loosely attached the clamps at the back for the key barrel, you can then remove the front bolt and apply a small quantity of stud lock to the end of the threads. We now need to position our handlebars correctly. making sure the handlebars are at the same angle as the steering column, and the centre bar of the handlebars is an equal distance between the front and the rear bolts. We also need to make sure as we tighten them up that the gap on the clamps is equal at the front and the rear, and that the handlebars are central using the notches in them. We are now ready to attach our lower shock bolts to the swing arm. To do this, select one of the shorter bolts from your various nuts and bolts fixing bag, and also the relevant size nut to go onto it. Apply a small amount of stud lock to the end of the threads. Lift your front swing arm up and align the shock with the mounting point on it. And place your bolt through with the threads going towards the inside. And attach the nut onto the end of the bolt. Using a 10 and 13 spanner or socket combination, fully tighten up the lower shock bolt, making sure there is no side-to-side play in the shock. Repeat the process on the opposite side. We're now ready to fit a front bull bar onto the quad. Remove the nuts and bolts at the top section, and then remove the bolts that are attached to the frame and the bottom section. Place a small quantity of stud lock onto the end of the threads of one of the bolts, and align your bull bar with the lower mounting point, and reattach the bolt loosely at this point. Repeat the process on the opposite side. Place some stud lock onto one of the bolts from the top section, putting it through the bull bar from the outside. Attach the nut on the inside, and then repeat the process on the opposite side. Once all your bolts are attached and aligned, fully tighten all the bolts using a 10 spanner or socket on the bottom bolts and a 10 and 13 spanner socket combination on the top bolts. We're now going to attach the lower shock bolt on the rear of the quad to the swing arm. Again, using one of the shorter bolts from your nut and bolts pack. Align the shock with the swing arm, and then place the bolt through to hold it in position. Once you have done this, apply a small quantity of stud lock to the end of the threads, then attach a nut from your nut and bolts bag to the end of it and fully tighten using a 10 and 13 spanner. We're now ready to fit our rear reflectors to the bike. Remove the nut from the back of the rear reflector and apply a small quantity of stud lock to the end of the threads. Place your reflector through the mounting bracket and reattach the nut. Using an 8 spanner, fully tighten the nut, making sure that the reflector is square and neat on the vehicle. We're now going to fit our fuel cap and fuel breather pipe. Screw your fuel cap onto the fuel tank and then push your breather pipe onto the centre of the fuel cap. Route your fuel pipe down towards the front of the vehicle like so. We will now fit our bar pad to the vehicle, remove the Velcro cover. Then carefully cut down the centre of the bar pad with a pair of scissors. And fit it to the handlebars. Replace the Velcro cover over the top of the bar pad. We've now fully assembled our 49cc big wheel mini quad. However, we do need to do a full nut and bolt check over the vehicle and set the vehicle up before its first use. To start off with, we're going to level off the brake levers on the vehicle. For your child's comfort, they need to be angled slightly down on the vehicle rather than in the position they are now. Using a 5 Allen key, loosen off the brake lever and then angle it down to the desired position. Once you are happy with this position, retighten the brake lever. Moving over to the opposite side of the quad, loosen off the brake lever. And then looking across the handlebars, level it off with the one you have set on the opposite side. Once you're happy with this position, retighten the brake lever. We will then position our kill switch correctly using a Phillips screwdriver, loosen off one of the screws on the back of the kill switch. Angle it around towards the rider and retighten the screw. Same, we're going to adjust our bell into the correct position and make sure it is fully tight with the Phillips screwdriver. We're now going to fully nut and bolt check the vehicle, starting off with the front brake caliper. Use a 5 Allen key to check the mounting bolts are tight. We will then move on to the front stub axle. Using a 17 spanner and an 8 Allen key, we need to make sure that there is no side-to-side play in the stub axle, but the steering still moves freely so your child can turn it. Apply a small quantity of stud lock to the end of the threads. We're now going to tighten the track rod end on the same size using a 13 spanner on the bottom and a 6 Allen key on the top. Once we are happy with the tightness of this, apply a small quantity of stud lock to the end of the threads. We will then repeat this process on the opposite side of the quad, tightening the brake, stub axle and track rod end. Make sure you apply a small quantity of stud lock to the end of all the threads. We're now going to tighten the inside track rod ends using a 6 Allen key and 13 spanner. Make sure both of these are tight and apply a small quantity of stud lock to the end of the threads. We're going to now tighten the steering column lower mounting bracket using a 5 Allen key and a 10 spanner on each of the bolts. Once we're happy that this is tight, we'll apply a small quantity of stud lock to the end of the threads. Using a 17 socket, we're now going to tighten the nut at the bottom of the steering column. Make sure that you do not over tighten this. If you do, you'll make the steering too hard for your child to turn. Once you're happy with this, apply a small quantity of stud lock to the end of the threads. We're now going to tighten the swing arm bolt using a 12 and 14 spanners. Once we are happy that this is fully tight, apply a small quantity of stud lock to the end of the threads. Using 10 and 13 spanners, make sure your top shock bolts are tight. And apply a small quantity of stud lock to the end of the threads on both sides of the quad. Again, using the 10 and 13 spanners, we need to make sure that the steering column boss is tight at the top of the steering column. Once we are happy that it's tight on both sides, apply a small quantity of stud lock to the end of the threads. We're now ready to check all the plastic bolts on the quads. Using 10 spanner and 5 Allen key. Make sure you do not over tighten the plastics, as you can cause them to crack. The top bolts in this section here use a 4 Allen key. We are now going to tighten up our rear exhaust manifold mounting bracket using a 10 spanner and 5 Allen key. Once it is tight, use a small quantity of stud lock on the end of the threads. We will then use an 8 and 10 spanner to tighten our rear sprocket. Once we have tightened all 3 bolts, apply a small quantity of stud lock to the end of the threads. We are now going to tighten our top rear shock mounting bolt using a 10 and 13 spanner. Once we are happy this is tight, apply a small quantity of stud lock to the end of the threads. We are now going to tighten our rear swing arm bolt using a 12 and 14 spanner. Once this is tight, apply a small quantity of stud lock to the end of the threads. We'll now check the heat shield is tight on the end of the exhaust using a 4 Allen key. Using a 5 Allen key, make sure the front heat shield is tight. Check all of the chain guard mounting bolts, again using the 4 Allen key. For the purpose of this video, we have now turned the quad onto its side to show you the position of the engine mounting bolts. Use your 5 Allen key to check that all 4 of them are tight, and then move on to the exhaust manifold bolts, checking that they are tight as well using a 5 Allen key. Never tip the quad on its side like this if you have fuel in the tank. Holding the rear brake on, make sure your rear wheels are tight using a 22mm socket. Once you are happy both sides are tight, apply a small quantity of stud lock to the end of the threads. We're now going to check the front wheels are tight. We need to make sure there is no side-to-side play in the front wheels, but that they also spin over freely. Make sure that you do not over tighten the front wheel nuts, as this could cause the bearings to overheat and fail, or if one side is tighter than the other, cause the quad to pull to the left or the right. As you are tightening the front wheel, keep doing small adjustments. Once you are happy with the front wheel, apply a small quantity of stud lock to the end of the threads. Then repeat this process on the opposite side. We're now ready to set the brakes on the vehicle. First thing we need to do is make sure the pad on the wheel side is as close as possible to the disc without touching it. To start off with, we're going to wind the inside pad out. Using a 2.5 Allen key, hold the bolt in the centre of the caliper and then use an 8 spanner to loosen off the nut. We can then wind this bolt out to move the inner pad away from the disc. Using the adjusters at the top and the bottom, we can move the outside of the caliper closer or further away from the brake disc. Make sure that you set both sides equally to ensure equal wear on the brake pads. You can use an Allen key to adjust these if they are too tight to turn by finger. Once you are happy with the pad on the outside, we can then wind the inner pad closer to the disc. Hold the nut using an 8 spanner and then using a 2.5 Allen key, set the pad as close as possible to the disc without touching it. Keep checking the brake is pulling on properly by applying your front brake lever. Once you are happy with the performance of this brake, repeat the process on the opposite side. We now need to make sure that our brakes are pulling equally. To do this, we will spin both wheels over and then apply the front brakes. We're now going to set the tracking on this vehicle. Using a 13 spanner, loosen off the nuts against track rod ends on both sides of the track rod. One side will be a left hand thread and one side will be a right hand thread. As you can see, by rotating the track rod, it alters the angle of the front wheel. This is towing out and this is towing in. We need to set the tracking so it is neutral and straight. To do this, we need to make sure the steering is straight on the quad. And then looking down the edge of the back wheel to the edge of the front wheel, we rotate the track rod around until both wheels are running parallel with each other. Keep checking that the steering is straight on your vehicle during this process. Once you are happy with the tracking, you can then wind the nuts back out against the track rod ends, making sure that you hold the track rod in the centre so that it doesn't move, and lock them off with a 13 spanner. Repeat this process on the opposite side of the quad. We are now going to set the chain tension on our 49cc petrol mini quad. Start off with using an 8 spanner or socket. Loosen off the bearing carriers on the left and right hand side of the quad. Do not fully undo these bolts. Using an Allen key, insert it into one of the holes on the outside of the bearing carrier, which you will see are actually an oblong shape rather than round. By rotating these around, we can move the axle further away or closer to the engine. This alters the chain tension. When you set these, make sure that both sides of the vehicle are equal. So if the holes are at 3 and 6 on one side, they're at 3 and 6 on the opposite side. Otherwise, this will cause your vehicle to pull to the left or the right once the chain tension is set. A small adjustment makes a big difference to the chain tension. Once you are happy that the chain tension is correct, retighten your bearing carrier bolts on the top and bottom, ensuring that the gap is equal on both sides. Make sure you check your chain tension once you have fully tightened the bolts. We have now fully built and nut and bolt checked our 49cc petrol mini quad. And that's how you build your new vehicle. I hope you found this guide useful. Now let the fun begin.